The snow had been falling for 3 hours by the time the convoy's lead vehicle broke through the tree line at the base of Mount Caldwell, and the thing about snow at 6,007 feet is that it doesn't fall so much as it occupies. It fills the air. It erases distance. It turns the world into a single white surface with no horizon and no depth. The kind of whiteout that makes seasoned drivers slow to a crawl and grip the wheel with both hands and watch the taillights of the vehicle ahead like they're the only fixed point left in the universe. At the Caldwell Mountain Veterans Rehabilitation Center, perched on a ridge that the locals had been telling the developers was a bad idea for 40 years, the wind came down off the peak in long descending sheets, and the helipad on the East Terrace, rarely used, mostly ceremonial. The kind of infrastructure that exists for the brochure more than the emergency was already buried under 4 inches of accumulation that nobody had thought to clear because nobody had thought it would be needed tonight. Maya Brennan thought it would be needed tonight. She'd been standing at the East Terrace doors for 11 minutes watching the sky, holding a thermal patient blanket against her chest with one arm and a radio in her other hand that had been giving her fragments instead of information for the better part of an hour. Inbound. Air ambulance. Hypothermic cascade, possible cardiac involvement, patient nonverbal on last contact. The dispatcher's voice had kept cutting out, swallowed by the weather, and what reached her arrived in pieces she had to assemble herself, which was fine, because assembling incomplete pictures into actionable shapes was the one thing she'd never stopped being good at even after everything that had happened in the years between the place she'd learned it and the place she was standing now. The charge nurse had called ahead. Search and rescue extraction off the north face, a backcountry skier who'd been missing for 9 hours before a thermal imaging pass found him wedged in a ravine. They'd warmed him in the field, stabilized him in the field, and that word again, stabilized, had come through the radio static with the smooth confidence of people who believed it was a finish line rather than a holding pattern. Maya had heard that word in a lot of languages and a lot of weather. And she'd learned that hypothermic stabilization was a story the cold let you believe right up until the moment the body started rewarming and the core temperature afterdrop sent the heart into a rhythm it had no business attempting. She turned to the 2 staff members behind her near the warm interior. I need active rewarming staged at the terrace doors. Warm IV fluids in the cabinet, the bear hugger unit, and the D5 pads pulled and ready before he's inside, not after. The younger one, a transport tech maybe a year and a half into the job, started moving toward the supply room. The other one didn't. Roland, 46, the name stitched in cursive over the pocket of his fleece. The senior facilities and transport coordinator who'd spent long enough being the most tenured person in any given hallway that he'd come to mistake tenure for the final word on everything, folded his arms. That's the flight crew's call when they land, Roland said. We don't pre-stage cardiac equipment on a hypothermia transport. That's not how we do it here. I know how you do it here. I want it staged anyway. It's not your protocol to make, Brennan, your floor staff. If you're watching a story like this one for the first time, this is the moment to stay with it. Because what unfolds over the next several minutes is the kind of thing that never makes it into the incident log the way it actually happened. The people who were on that terrace would tell it differently afterward depending on where they'd been standing, which is usually a sign that the real version is somewhere in the space between all of them. The aircraft came in low and loud, a search and rescue rotorcraft heavier than the medical variants she was used to fighting the downdraft coming off the peak. Its searchlight carving a cone of swirling white as it descended toward a helipad that hadn't been cleared. The rotor wash hit the unswept snow and turned it into a horizontal storm, a sudden ground blizzard that pushed everyone on the terrace back a full step, hands up, faces turned. Everyone except Maya, who turned her shoulder into it and held her ground, because she'd learned that particular stance a long time ago in places where stepping back meant losing seconds you couldn't get back. The skids touched down hard, then settled, and before the rotors had wound down, a crew door slid open and 2 members of the SAR team were out, moving with the economy of people who'd done extractions in worse than this. Behind them came a man in cold-weather flight gear with a medical tab on his shoulder, the flight paramedic, young, focused, carrying the specific tightness in his movements that comes from running on adrenaline for 9 hours straight. And behind him, the litter. The patient was a big man, 60s, broad through the shoulders even under the layers of insulation they'd packed around him, with the kind of frame that suggested a lifetime of physical work or military bearing or both. He was bundled in a rescue cocoon, the heat-reflective wrap cinched tight around him in the field, which was exactly right for moving him off a mountain and exactly wrong for what came next, because nobody had loosened it for the controlled, monitored phase of rewarming, and the wrap that had saved him from the cold was now insulating him against the very monitoring that would catch what the cold had set in motion. Maya moved toward the litter. The flight paramedic moved to cut her off. "Ma'am, the receiving physician hasn't. I'm the receiving floor nurse. Let me see his rhythm strip." A SAR team member, big, young, with the planted stance of someone who'd been told all night that this patient was important and had taken the instruction personally, stepped into her path. "Colonel Avery's care is being coordinated through the lift team. You need to move," she said at once, not loud, not angry. She said it the way you say a thing when the next sentence is already finished in your head, and you'd rather not have to say that one out loud too. He moved. She was at the litter in 3 steps, and one look confirmed the shape she'd assembled out of all those broken radio fragments. The rescue wrap was cinched at the chest, undisturbed, since the field and the portable monitor clipped to the litter rail was showing a rhythm that the flight crew, in the noise and the cold and the relief of a successful extraction, had read as merely slow. Bradycardic, yes, but the morphology was wrong. The intervals were lengthening. This wasn't a heart beating slowly because it was cold. This was a heart edging toward the disorganized electrical state that a rewarming core can trigger. The after-drop arrhythmia that turns a save into a loss in the back of an ambulance while everyone congratulates each other on the rescue. She reached for the chest wrap. The flight paramedic caught her wrist, not hard, reflexive, the gesture of someone protecting a patient he'd carried off a mountain. "He's hypothermic. You don't want to overstimulate the myocardium. We keep him wrapped and warm him slow. He's already rewarming. His core's coming up and his afterdrop is hitting his conduction. If we keep him cocooned and unmonitored, he's going to drop into a lethal rhythm in the next 2 minutes, and you won't see it coming because the wrap is hiding his chest. I need the pads on. I need eyes on his heart. I need you to trust me for 90 seconds. A voice behind her cut across the terrace, clipped and certain, the voice of someone who had spent a long career being the last word in any room. "Step back from him, now." She didn't step back. She loosened the chest wrap and reached for the D5 pads the young tech had thankfully staged at the door. The major who'd given the order she'd learn his rank later. She heard him start across the snow toward her, and then she heard him stop. She would find out afterward that he stopped because of what came off the helicopter next. It had been riding in the rear of the cabin, and nobody had mentioned it because in the chaos of the landing, nobody had thought to. A German Shepherd gray through the muzzle, wearing a faded working harness, the kind of dog that doesn't move with the loose enthusiasm of a pet, but with the deliberate, conserving economy of an animal that has spent years being told that motion has a cost. It came down out of the cabin and onto the snow, and it ignored everyone, ignored the major, ignored the SAR team, ignored Roland, who'd backed up so far he was pressed against the terrace doors. It walked straight to Maya's left side, and it sat. And then it did the thing that none of the witnesses afterward could quite describe the same way, because none of them had a category ready for it. It lowered its front end down into the snow, not a playbow, not quite a submission, something more intentional than either, and it held the posture, the kind of thing a trained working dog does for exactly one kind of person, the one who handled it, or the one who'd once pulled it back from something it shouldn't have survived. The major had stopped moving entirely. He was looking at the dog, then at Maya, then back at the dog, and you could see the arithmetic happening behind his eyes even through the falling snow. Maya wasn't looking at any of them. "I need someone to support his airway and keep his head neutral," she said, her voice flat and even and cutting clean through the wind. The cadence of someone reading from a checklist she'd written herself 100 times in worse conditions than this. "Pads going on now, anterior lateral. I need the warm fluids running, not the cold saline, the warmed bag. And I need everyone who is not actively helping me to give me 4 feet of room." The flight paramedic moved first, then a SAR team member. Then, after a half second that felt like it had architecture to it, the young transport tech arrived with the bear hugger unit, slipping once on the snow, catching himself, getting there. Roland didn't move. He was watching the dog. The dog was still at her side, Maya worked in a silence that wasn't quiet at all. It was dense, full, entirely interior. She got the pads on and the monitor reading clean and watched the rhythm strip resolve into the deteriorating pattern she'd predicted. And she had the warmed fluids running, and the active rewarming started before the strip could finish its argument. Her hands had the geometry of it memorized below the level of conscious thought, which is the only way to explain why she was already past the decision point by the time the facility's medical director came out onto the terrace behind her. The heart, given warmth where it needed, warmth and monitoring where it needed monitoring, hesitated at the edge of the rhythm it had been falling toward and then held. The rate climbed, 8 beats, 12. The intervals pulling back toward something organized. The strip steadying like a held breath finally released. The medical director reached the litter and surveyed a scene that didn't match anything in the procedure manual. A floor nurse crouched over a decorated Army colonel, defib pads placed, rewarming running, rhythm pulling back from the edge. An aging working dog sitting at her heel like she'd given a command no one else had heard. Doctorated. Lena Osei, 12 years running the medical side of Caldwell, the kind of authority that had become so settled it was practically load-bearing, stopped and processed it. Brennan. She said the name the way you say a name when you're recalibrating something underneath it. Rewarming after-drop arrhythmia secondary to occlusive field wrap left in place through transport, Maya said without looking up. Wraps loosened, monitored rewarming, started warm fluids running. He needs a core temp probe, continuous telemetry, and electrolytes drawn before anyone relaxes. The field report undersold how far his rhythm had already drifted. Osei looked at the strip, then at the pad placement, then at Maya's hands, which were already moving to support the patient as the staff came in to take over. She didn't say what she was thinking. She'd say it later, to no one in particular, in the corridor outside the warming bay, and what she'd say was, she read that rhythm off a litter in a whiteout. But that was later. Right now the snow was still coming down, and the major was standing 3 feet away with an expression that had moved past command composure into something genuinely unsettled. He was looking at the dog, which hadn't left Maya's side, then at the colonel, who was breathing, then at her. "Where did you serve?" he asked. She finished what she was doing before she answered. That was characteristic. The sentence could wait. The hands couldn't. "I didn't enlist," she said. "I went over as contract critical care, 3 rotations, Bagram, Mosul, and one I'm not going to name." The major absorbed that. "That dog is Colonel Avery's working dog, retired now. He doesn't take a posture like that for anyone outside the colonel's old detail. He took it from me at the forward aid station outside Mosul," she said, after a vehicle strike came through. He was riding out the blast noise badly, and his handler had his hands full with the wounded, so I sat on the floor with him for the better part of an hour with my back against the wall. Dogs don't remember the way we do, but they remember." She stood, 5'8", scrubs gone damp at the shoulders where the snow had melted into them, a strand of dark hair pulled loose across her cheek. She looked at the major with brown eyes that held almost none of the adrenaline that was visibly moving through everyone else on the terrace. "He needs to be inside," she said. They moved. The ride down to the warming unit was a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of a group of people silently revising something they'd been certain of an hour ago. Roland stood in the corner with his hands clasped, looking at the floor. The flight paramedic stood beside Maya with the posture of a man who had something to say and hadn't yet found the words. The young transport tech kept glancing at the dog, whose harness clip ticked softly against the wall of the elevator. Colonel Avery, 33 years of service, 2 combat deployments. A chest full of ribbons folded somewhere in a drawer at a house his late wife had decorated, and he'd never had the heart to change, surfaced partway as the unit passed the 2nd floor. Not fully. The kind of partial surfacing where the body checks in before the mind commits to it. His eyes drifted, then somehow found her where she stood at his left, where she'd been since the terrace. Watching his breathing with the attention of someone who'd learned the hard way that the moment you stop watching is the moment everything changes. His lips moved. Most of the people in the elevator missed it. She was close enough. "Still here," she said, and the colonel's eyes closed again, and his breathing held, and the elevator descended. In the warming unit over the next 2 hours, the core temp probe went in clean. The telemetry stayed organized. The electrolytes came back manageable, and Colonel Avery's status moved from critical to guarded to something that had begun to resemble sleep. The storm kept on outside, but down here the windows took the worst of it, and you could only hear the wind if you stood still and listened for it. Maya charted at the unit station at 11:52 p.m. with a cup of coffee she hadn't tasted in half an hour. The dog had settled in the hallway outside the colonel's room, chin on its paws, eyes on the door. Someone from the administrative side had raised a concern about an animal on a clinical floor, and someone with rank had made a single phone call, and the concern had been quietly processed into nothing. Dr. Tarmont. Osei came to the station near midnight and stood across from her for a moment. The field report said stable, Maya said before Osei could begin. I know. Someone decided that Rapp was fine to leave cinched for the whole transport. That's not the weather. That's a handoff that skipped a step. I know, Maya. She set a folder on the counter. You'll be asked to take part in the case review. Maya looked at the folder. Is that optional? For you? Osei said. Probably not. She nodded once and went back to her chart. What she didn't say, not to Osei, not to the major, not to the flight paramedic who eventually found the words and used them, which were only, I'm sorry and thank you, was what those rotations had cost her. Not in the counted way, the years and the exposure and the line items. In the specific way, her last tour hadn't ended on a scheduled rotation home. It had ended with a casualty she was stabilizing when a second strike came through, and a piece of the building she'd been kneeling beside had come down across her shoulder, and her hearing in one ear had never fully come back, and she'd worked another 5 hours before she'd let anyone look at her because they were short-handed, and she was still upright. By the time she let them, she'd been grounded and put on a transport home she only half remembered. She'd come to Caldwell Mountain 3 years ago, not because it was the most she could do, because it was a place high and quiet enough that she could stand still long enough to remember who she was when nothing was on fire. Some nights that worked. Some nights, like tonight, the fire came up the mountain to find her. She finished the chart at 12:18 a.m. The snow had eased to a thin, drifting fall. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stood there a while with her arms crossed and the cold coffee in her right hand looking down at the valley below. The scattered lights of the town softened by frosted glass, the dark mass of the mountain above with its peak lost in cloud. The particular stillness of a care facility at night that is not actually still but has only learned to move quietly. She heard the dog before she saw it, nails clicking on the floor. It had apparently been granted some latitude by whoever was now responsible for it, or had simply decided the latitude was its own to define, and it came down the corridor and pressed its head against her left thigh and held it there the way old dogs do when they've decided you are someone worth being near. She put her hand on its head, felt the gray muzzle, the slight tremor of an animal that had carried its own years up its own mountains. Outside, a snowplow passed somewhere far below, its amber light sweeping slow across the white road. Inside, the machines kept their quiet measurements. In the room down the hall, a colonel who had survived 2 wars and 1 bad night on a mountain breathed steadily, the crisis reduced now to a data point. The body talked back from the edge it had drifted toward. She stood there for a while, not thinking about the terrace or Roland's folded arms or the rap or the rhythm strip or the precise moment the major's certainty had come apart behind his eyes, not replaying any of it. Just standing at the window with the dog's weight against her leg and the valley below and the snow still coming down, softer now, almost gentle, the way weather sometimes turns apologetic after it's shown you what it's capable of. She was very tired. She was also, in a way she wouldn't have tried to put a word to, intact. In the morning, she'd find a folded note left on the unit station. It wouldn't be signed. The handwriting would be the kind that belonged to someone more comfortable with operational orders than personal notes, and it would say only, "The dog knew you first." That would be all. She'd read it once, fold it, put it in her pocket, and go on with her shift. But that was morning. Right now it was still night, and the mountain was dark and cold and alive in its way, and she was still standing. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt true about the weight people carry without ever announcing it, about what competence actually looks like when it has nothing to prove, then you might find it surfacing later. In the middle of something ordinary. That's what the best of these stories do. They don't just pass through you, they stay. Subscribe if you want more. We'll be here.